Hey folks, welcome back to our Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark.
And I'm Randy.
Today we're taking a look at Terror Below.
Terror Below is brought to you by Renegade Games. It plays 2 to 5 players, ages 10 and up, and each game takes between 45 and 60 minutes to play.
Great, well let's go see if we can stop those pesky worms. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, under the ground, is truly the Terror Below. The government has been conducting experiments, but not just standard experiments that you'd expect. They're conducting worm experiments.
And not just worms like you'd find in your garden, but WORMS, Weapons of Remote Massacre.
Now it's up to us, the town folk, to go collect some eggs, destroy some worms, and collect the bounty. Are you up to the challenge?
The basic premise of Terror Below is that there are these giant worms beneath the ground, and as you drive various vehicles across the ground, it irritates the worms and causes them to move a little bit.
It does indeed.
Ultimately, when they get agitated enough, they will attack and leave behind an egg and lots of rubble in their wake. And so the game starts, the way you set up the game involves distributing eggs and rubble based upon previous worm attacks before you actually populate the worms in the ground for your current play.
So after you set up the initial eggs and rubble, then it's time to get everything into play. So the worms come out, you're going to put target tokens where the worms are currently moving under the ground, and you're going to set up your bounty. These bounties are made up of not only delivering eggs, but hunting the worms. And so finish setting up things around the board by placing all the various tokens, the rubble, the eggs, and the various cards that you're going to be tapping into throughout the game. You've got weapon cards, you've got item cards, you've got the worm cards, you've got more bounties, and of course you have vehicles. Vehicles are going to become very integral to what you're going to be doing throughout the game.
After you set up the main board, each player will be given a reference card, 3 of these green vehicle cards, 3 of these purple character cards, of which they have to choose one to be the leader and the others will be subordinate and be placed underneath the leader card. They'll be given 1 item card, 1 weapon card, and 1 of these vehicle tokens, which they will place on one of the 5 locations on the board. Now, not just one of the squares, but something like the general store or the motel or the government facility.
So it's important to note that these characters that you receive and when you choose your leader, that you choose them wisely because they all have special abilities and potentially could really assist you throughout the game. So, for instance, we have Shep, the farm dog. He's actually pretty powerful because he can clear 2 rubble for 1 action. And we'll get into why rubble is so important in a bit. So on your turn, there are 3 main things you're going to be doing. You're going to be playing a vehicle card. You're going to be resolving that card and performing actions. And then you're going to be refilling your hand. And at the end of all that, you're going to see if there's a worm attack. So the first thing you do is play that vehicle card. And there's a couple things to note here. In the top corner of the vehicle card will show you how many action points you actually get to perform this turn. And you'll place it under one of the worms. And you have to be careful here because the worms are very sensitive, like Randy said before, and too many vehicles entering in an area with a worm can cause that worm to attack. So you got to keep that in mind. So placing that card below a worm will dictate where the target icon is going to move. Now, how does that work? Across the bottom of the card, there are icons showing how and where those tokens move across the board. They might move up and over or down and over. So you have to pay attention to those icons, and that's one of the first things you'll do is move those target tokens to the appropriate spot. And so moving that token across the board is known as distracting the worm. And you'll look at the bottom of your card to see where that token's going to move. And it's very clear, the icons are very straightforward in showing you how to move that token.
Now, as you're playing your vehicle cards and doing these distractions, keep in mind you're not doing that unintentionally.
Right.
Distractions are how you move the worms so that eventually and inevitably when they attack, they're either closer to your opponents or further away from yourself, unless you're ready to hunt them, in which case you might want to move them closer to you so you can get the bounty for killing a worm. After you're done with the distractions, it's time for playing actions. You have as many action points as are shown in the upper left of the vehicle card you just played. Now, there are 5 different types of actions. The first is to move your vehicle token to one of the adjacent spaces. And by adjacent, we mean orthogonally, either up, down, left, or right. You can only move into empty spaces that are, by empty I mean spaces without rubble.
Right.
Now, they can have the target markers in them, they can have eggs in them, and they can even have your opponent markers in there as long as you don't end your movement in a space with your opponent. When you move, you basically just take your piece and move it to one of those spots. But if it has rubble in it, you can't move there yet. So you might want to use the second type of action, which is clearing rubble. For each action point you spend, you can remove one piece of rubble from an adjacent space. So if there's 2 rubbles in a space where you're wanting to move, it's going to cost you 2 action points. The third type of action is kind of a Dukes of Hazzard thing. And for those of you who remember, these guys were really experts in driving their car.
Exactly.
You can jump one of your opponent's cars for 1 action point.
But you're super skilled at
it. If you're skilled, yes. And you can jump over their car, land on the other space, but you can also change directions in mid-air and land on the space to the left or to the right as well. So if you do that, again, it's important that there's no rubble in that location. But if you do that, that actually gets you an extra, you move an additional spot for a simple 1 action point. The fourth thing you can do is to deliver eggs. And deliver eggs is how you get the victory points in the game. It's really the meat of the game.
It really is.
You can deliver an egg to any of the 5 locations on the board, any of the buildings shown there. And if there is a bounty associated with that, delivering that type of egg to that type of location, you collect that bounty. And you might even be using a hidden bounty, but we'll talk about that more in a second. And the last thing you can do is to collect all eggs in one space for an action point. So if there are multiple eggs in your space, you can spend an action point to get them. But the reason I mentioned that last as the 5th action is because once you perform that action, your turn is done. It's an exhausting task picking up all these worm eggs. So if you do that, be aware that you can't use any of your remaining action points.
So let's take a closer look at delivering these eggs, because that's really, like Randy said, the meat where you're going to get those victory points. And whenever you go to a location and deliver an egg, you can collect a victory point. But hold on a sec, there might be a bounty. You look across the top of the board, and if that particular location has a certain type of egg that it requires, and you deliver that egg, then you get to collect that card, which will give you more victory points, and that is usually the better thing to do. So, not only are you delivering eggs to get victory points and complete these deliveries, but there's also bonuses to be had.
That's right. Don't confuse bounties with bonuses. They're actually different. So whether you've gotten the default 1 victory point for delivering an egg to any location, or you've gotten a bounty, there is a separate bonus depending upon which location you're in. So let's look at these. The motel gives you 1 additional victory point. Again, whether you've gotten a victory point without a bounty or the actual bounty, you get 1 additional victory point. For the general store, you get 1 item card, which can be really handy.
Really handy.
The State Patrol gives you a weapon, so you get something from their armory. And again, that can be really useful for hunting worms. The hospital allows you to resurrect a dead character because worms are violent creatures and you can lose your leader as you're fighting the worms. And lastly, you can get a hidden bounty from the government facility. Now, when you drop off an egg there, you can either choose one of the bounties that are shown and take that to yourself and have it face down as a hidden bounty that only you can fulfill, or you can take one of the face down bounties and make that your hidden bounty.
And then back to the vehicle card. We have that one special action or ability that's on the card that you haven't actually activated yet. And they do various things, so you have to keep those in mind as you're moving and manipulating and doing your actions. This one in particular for the sedan is you get to move any target token 2 spaces. Then, at the end of your turn, it's time to check and see if any of the worms will attack. And again, if you had too many vehicles in an area where a worm is, that will trigger the attack. And you'll know that because at the bottom of the worm card, it shows how many vehicles will trigger that attack. And when it does, explosiveness happens. The worm comes up out of the ground and rubble flies everywhere and a new egg is deposited.
As Mark said, when the worm attacks, an egg gets deposited and rubble flies everywhere. The exact pattern for the egg and the rubble is shown here on the card. So the egg goes in the darkly shaded spots and the rubble flies into the light shaded spots, except for places where there's already 2 rubble. There can only be a maximum of 2 rubble per space. Now, any character that has had an egg dropped on him or rubble hit him is now actively engaged in the hunt. The game is basically a competitive game, but at this point it might feel more like a cooperative game because if you don't defeat the worm, if all players engaged in the hunt don't defeat the worm, they all die.
So this is really important.
It's very important.
Your lead character that you're using has those special abilities. You may not want to lose them.
Right. So you start with the player who has most recently taken his turn. Remember that worms only attack in between players' turns. So the player who took his turn before the worm attacked gets to start. he gets to use his weapons, as many weapons as he wants to try to defeat the worm, or at least do as much damage as he can. And potentially he might have items that also do some damage.
Right.
So once he's completed his turn, if he hasn't killed the worm, the control passes to the next player clockwise, who is engaged in the hunt. Now, if the players are able to do as much damage as is shown in the heart icon at the bottom of the worm card, the player who made the killing blow gets a victory point. Either A, he gets the default 1 victory point for defeating the worm, or if there is a bounty shown in the active bounty line, and you see some of these are delivery, but some of these show hunt at the top. If the worm type, not color, but the type, matches the name shown here, the player who made the killing blow gets to take this card for himself instead of the default 1 victory point.
Which is worth typically a lot more points.
4 is a fair amount there.
Yeah.
Now, if the players don't successfully kill the worm, all players engaged in the hunt have their lead character die. Their leader dies and they lose that ability here, and that gets tucked below all the others. It gets turned over to the death side, and the player gets to choose from his remaining characters which one he wants to be the leader. Now, don't be too depressed if your character dies, or if our dear Shep the farm dog dies, because if you drop an egg off at the hospital, remember you can resurrect one of your dead characters, which is always nice.
Yep. And it's important to note too that when you're using your weapons and items, a lot of these are one-time use.
Yes.
You're going to use them and they're out. So you may go through a heavy battle, but then end up with no weapons at the end.
This is true. Now, after the worm has attacked, whether you've been successful or whether you've unfortunately been defeated, the worm itself is gone. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll take this particular worm and all the vehicles that are played underneath him, and you'll discard him, and you will immediately put a new worm in his place. You'll place the corresponding target token wherever it says here in these coordinates shown by these 2 dice, and the game continues with the next player in line.
It does, showing just how relentless the worms truly are. Now, since we just finished that big battle and we lost all our weapons, it's important to note that there's a couple different ways to get weapons and items. So not only visiting locations will do that, but as you collect rubble, you can turn rubble in for weapons and items as well. So the game does give you some more avenues to get those items.
Right, and this is the upside of it. As you're clearing rubble away from spots you want to move into, it's like, this is a burden. But no, it's actually, each rubble you collect is 1/3 of a way to a new item or new weapon. And you don't have to drop the rubble off anywhere. As soon as you've collected 3 rubble, you immediately choose to take either an item or a weapon card.
And so, through the course of killing these worms and collecting eggs, your end goal here is to be the first player to collect 20 points.
Now, 20 points means you win the game, but it doesn't mean actually the worms have stopped.
No.
It just means that you've gotten enough loot and bounty that you can move out of town.
Time to get out of Dodge.
That's right.
All right, folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form. So keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes that still may occur. You know, I love the tension in this game. I love the back and forth and how much you feel the pressure of the worms and they're moving below you.
Yeah, it's the definite trade-off between saying, well, I really want to collect this egg and benefit myself, or can I push that worm closer to somebody else and then trigger their attack? So that can be a lot of fun making those choices.
And then you might be thinking you're collecting a lot of these eggs and you're doing good, you got a lot of weapons, but then you deliver everything and you defeat a worm and suddenly, oh, I got to make weapons a priority again.
Right.
And victory points have to go to the wayside for now. So there's a lot of good decisions to be made throughout the game. But folks, ultimately, if this looks like a game that would be of interest to you, I'm sure they'd appreciate your support.
Absolutely.
So I think that's it from us.
Yep.
And until next time,
we'll see you at the table.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching the Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.